me not see it.
My grandfather spent 40 years of his life working for a major dictionary publisher, tucked away in a home office that always carried the scent of old paper and bitter tea. He was a lexicographer, but toward the end, he became obsessed with something the industry calls ghost words. These are accidents, typos, or bits of linguistic driftwood that make it into official print because of a clerical error or a tired editor. Most people find them interesting or funny, like a trivia fact. To him, they were a sickness in the language. He used to tell me that words were the only things holding our reality in its proper shape, and a word that didn't have a meaning was like a hole in a dam. If you let the water start leaking through, eventually the whole structure is going to come apart. I didn't take him seriously back then. He was an old man who had spent too much time staring at small print. When he disappeared, the police searched his house and found nothing but thousands of loose pages and books with the spines cracked open. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, just an empty house with the back door wide open. I was the one who had to go through his things, and that's when I found the note on his desk. It was just a single word circled in red ink on a scrap of yellowed parchment. It looked like a jumble of vowels and consonants that didn't quite belong together, something that felt jagged just to look at. Underneath it, he'd written a frantic warning. He told me not to say it, and not even to look at the shape of the letters for too long. He said that once the sound exists in the air, the world realizes that you don't belong here either. I'm the kind of person who scoffs at ghost stories. I looked at that word, and I said it out loud, clear and firm, just to prove to the empty room that my grandfather had finally lost his mind before he walked out that door. The sound of it was oily and wrong. It didn't vibrate in my throat the way a normal word does. It felt like I was coughing up a piece of dry wool. I waited for something to happen. I waited for the walls to shake or for a shadow to jump out of the corner. Nothing happened. The house stayed silent, the sun kept shining through the dusty windows, and I felt like an idiot for even being nervous. I crumpled the note, tossed it into the trash, and went home to my wife. When I walked through my front door, Sarah was in the kitchen. She was humming something, moving between the stove and the counter. I called out her name, but she didn't turn around. I thought she was just annoyed with me for being late, so I walked up behind her to put my hand on her shoulder. The second my fingers touched her skin, she let out a scream that I will never forget. It wasn't a scream of surprise, it was the sound of a woman who had just found a masked intruder in her home. She spun around, clutching a steak knife, her eyes wide with a level of terror that made my stomach drop. She kept asking me who I was and how I got into the house. She was shaking so hard the knife was rattling against the granite. I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke, a really dark, messed up joke. But the look in her eyes was too real. There was no recognition there, not even a spark of it. To her, I was a complete stranger who had materialized in her kitchen. I tried to calm her down, calling her by her pet names, reminding her of the dinner we had the night before. She just backed away into the living room, screaming for me to stay away and threatening to call the police. I grabbed our wedding album from the shelf, desperate to show her the proof. I flipped it open to the first page, the one where we're standing under the oak tree in her parents' backyard. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. Sarah was there, looking beautiful in her white dress, smiling at the camera. But the space next to her, the space where I should have been, was a mess. It looked like someone had smeared a thick glob of grease across the lens before taking the shot. There was a shape there, a tall blur that suggested a person, but there were no features, no face, no identity. I flipped through the rest of the pages. Our honeymoon in Italy, our first Christmas, the hike we took last summer. In every single photo, I was a smudge of gray, a visual error that the paper was trying to reject. I left before the police arrived. I couldn't stand the way she looked at me, like I was a monster or a ghost. I got into my car, but the key didn't want to fit the ignition at first. It felt like the metal was slick, or like the lock was slowly forgetting what the key was supposed to do. I drove to my best friend's apartment, my mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe I was having a stroke. Maybe I was dreaming. But the air felt too sharp, and the seat beneath me felt too solid for a dream. When I got to Mark's place, I didn't even knock. I just burst in. He was sitting on the couch, but when he looked up, he didn't see his friend of 15 years. He saw a shadow. He didn't even speak. He just grabbed a lamp from the side table and swung it at me, yelling for me to get out. I ran. I didn't know where else to go, so I went to the public library. I needed a place where I could sit and think, a place where I could disappear into the stacks. That's where I am now. I've been sitting in the back corner of the reference section for 3 hours. I started noticing the changes about 40 minutes ago. It began with my hands. When I hold them up to the light of the reading lamp, they don't look solid anymore. They look translucent, like I'm made of frosted glass. I can see the faint outline of the table through my palms. There is no pain, which is the worst part. There's just a profound sense of coming undone. It feels like the universe is an editor going through a manuscript, and it finally noticed a typo that's been there for 30 years. It's not that I'm dying. You have to exist to die. I'm being deleted. I looked in a mirror in the restroom a few minutes ago. My face is starting to go. The eyes are just pale, watery gaps now. My skin looks like wet tissue paper that's being stretched too thin. I can see the pipes behind the wall through my own chest. I tried to scream, but the only thing that came out was that same dry, woolly sound, a noise that doesn't carry any meaning. I'm becoming a synonym for nothing. I can see a librarian walking toward my table. She's carrying a stack of books and looking right through me. I want to reach out and grab her arm, to feel the warmth of another human being one last time, but I'm afraid my hand will just pass through her like smoke. I can feel the weight of my own body disappearing. It's a lightness that feels like a curse, a thinning of the soul until there's nothing left to hold onto the world. The most horrifying part isn't the disappearing act. It's the realization of what my grandfather was trying to tell me. These words, these ghost words, they aren't just mistakes. They are predators. They wait in the dark corners of dictionaries, waiting for someone to give them life by breathing them into the air. And once you say it, you provide the bridge. The word needs a place to go, and it takes your place. Somewhere out there, there is a man who looks just like me, living my life, sleeping in my bed next to my wife. He is the correct version of the sentence, and I am the error being scrubbed away. My fingers are almost gone now. I can barely feel the pen in my hand as I write this. The ink on the page looks more real than I do. I can see the wood grain of the table through my forearms. The air feels thin, like I'm breathing in nothingness. In a few minutes, there won't even be a smudge left on the chair. I won't be a memory because there will be nothing left to remember. I'll just be a gap in the conversation, a space between breaths that nobody notices. If you find a word that doesn't make sense, a word that feels like it's biting your tongue when you try to shape it, please, just keep your mouth shut. Don't let the world correct you.
Next story.
The group chat had been our digital living room since high school. We were all in our mid-20s now, scattered across different time zones, but that Discord server was the one constant. We knew each other's vent sessions, shitty bosses, and relationship drama better than we knew our own neighbors. There were 7 of us, or at least, that was the number burned into my brain. Every time I looked at the sidebar, I expected to see 7 icons. But when I logged on last night to share a meme, the member count at the top of the list clearly said 6. I did a quick scan. Marcus, Elias, Sarah, Chloe, Jax, and me. That was 6. I sat there staring at the screen, a weird, hollow feeling settling in the pit of my stomach. I went through the list again. I even counted on my fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. My mind was hitting a wall, like a file on a hard drive that refused to open. I knew there was supposed to be another name there. I could almost see the shape of the letters in my mind's eye, but every time I tried to focus on it, the memory would slide away like wet soap. I started scrolling back through the general chat logs. At first, everything looked normal. But then I hit a thread from about 3 months ago where we were all discussing a movie we'd gone to see. Marcus had said something about the ending, and then there was this massive gap. It wasn't a deleted message notification. It was just nothing. A blank, white void of empty space where a message should have been. And right below it, Sarah had replied, "Yeah, I totally agree, that part was brutal." I kept scrolling. The further back I went, the worse it got. It looked like we were all a bunch of schizophrenics having half conversations with a ghost. There were jokes that made no sense because the setup was missing. There were long, heated arguments where only one side of the fight was visible. We were replying to questions that hadn't been asked and laughing at punchlines that weren't there. It was like watching a movie where one of the main actors had been digitally scrubbed out of every single frame, leaving the others to talk to thin air. The air in my room felt suddenly thin, making it hard to take a full breath. I pulled up the search bar and tried to look for mentions of him or her, but I didn't even know what pronouns to use. I typed the 7th person into the general chat. "Hey guys," I wrote. "Who used to be the 7th person in here? The count says 6, but the logs look like someone is missing." For a few minutes, the chat stayed silent. Then I saw the little bubble that said Jax was typing. He typed for a long time, then stopped. Then started again. Finally, instead of a message in the group, a private notification popped up from him. "Don't talk about it in the main channel," Jax messaged me. "I've been looking at the logs too." I thought I was losing my mind. I tried to remember the name about an hour ago, and as soon as the first syllable started to form in my head, I felt a piece of my brain go cold. Like a physical chill behind my eyes. I don't know who we're missing, but I know they're gone because they found the word. I called him. I didn't want to type anymore. When he picked up, his voice sounded brittle, like it might snap if he spoke too loud. He told me he'd been doing some digging into old emails, trying to find an invite link or a mention of the 7th friend. He found an old photo we took at a New Year's party 3 years ago. "I'm looking at the photo right now," Jax whispered. "There are 7 of us standing in Marcus's kitchen. But the 7th person, their face is just a smear. It's not a blur from the camera moving. It's like the pixels have been chewed away. And the worst part, looking at them makes my nose bleed." I felt a sudden, sharp pressure in my own sinuses. I told Jax to send me the photo. He did, and as soon as the file downloaded, I wished I hadn't asked. It was a standard, grainy cell phone shot. We all looked younger, holding red plastic cups. But standing between Sarah and Marcus was a tall figure. Where a face should have been, there was a jagged, gray distortion that looked like television static. It wasn't just on the surface of the photo, it felt like it was deeper, like a hole cut into the world. As I stared at the static, a name began to bubble up from the depths of my memory. It wasn't a normal name. It was a series of guttural, clicking sounds that felt wrong for a human throat to produce. It felt like a jagged piece of metal sliding into a lock. "Jax," I said, my voice shaking. "I think I remember. It starts with an S sound, right? But like a wet S?" "Stop," Jax barked. "Don't say it. If you say it, you make it real again. Whatever happened to them, it's because they said the word. They found some weird forum or some old text, and they wouldn't stop talking about it. Don't you remember the last night we actually saw them? And then, like a dam breaking, a memory flooded back. It wasn't a movie night. We were at a cabin. It was late, and the fire had died down to glowing embers. The seventh person, I still couldn't see their face, was sitting in the corner away from the light. They had been whispering for hours. Not to us, but to the shadows in the rafters. They kept saying that the world was just a layer of paint over something rotting, and that the only way to see the truth was to speak the language of the decay. They had looked at us, and for a second, the shadow over their face had lifted. I remembered eyes that weren't eyes anymore. They were just raw, red pits of exposed muscle and nerve endings. They had peeled their own eyelids off so they wouldn't have to blink. They wanted to see it all. I'm going to say it, they had whispered. The word that unspools the thread. I remember the sound that came out of their mouth. It wasn't a word. It was the sound of a throat being filled with wet dirt. It was the sound of a ribcage cracking open. As soon as the vibration hit the air, the room went freezing. The light didn't just dim, it seemed to be sucked out of the bulbs. The person didn't scream. They just began to unravel. I remember watching their skin split down the center of their chest. There was no blood at first, just a dark, viscous fluid that smelled like a slaughterhouse floor on a hot July day. It was a thick, cloying stench of old meat and iron. Their skin started to peel back in long, rhythmic strips, curling away from the muscle like wood shavings. They were being turned inside out by the sheer force of the sound they were making. We had all stood there, paralyzed. We watched as their teeth fell out one by one, clinking on the hardwood floor. We watched as their tongue lengthened and split, turning into something that looked like a nest of pale, writhing worms. And the whole time, that sound, that word, was vibrating in our bones. Then they were gone. Not like they ran away. They just ceased to be a solid object. They collapsed into a heap of wet, gray matter that evaporated into the floorboards before we could even process what we were seeing. And then, the most horrific part happened. We forgot. The moment the last trace of them vanished, our brains just rewired. We looked at each other, confused as to why we were all standing up in the dark. We cleaned up the spilled drink on the floor, which was actually the remains of our friend, and we went home. Our minds had performed a violent, instinctive act of self-censorship to protect us from the sheer wrongness of what we'd witnessed. "They're not gone, Jax," I said into the phone, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. They didn't die. They're still in the server. That's why the messages are blank. They're still typing. They're still trying to tell us the word. As I said it, my monitor flickered. A new message appeared in the group chat. It was from the blank space. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. My eyes were drawn to the screen. The empty space was gone. In its place was a string of characters that didn't belong to any known alphabet. They were jagged, oily-looking shapes that seemed to squirm on the white background of the chat window. I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my ears. A warm trickle of liquid began to run down my neck from my ear canal. I reached up and touched it. My fingers came away stained a deep, dark crimson. "Jax, I see it," I choked out. The message. It's not blank anymore. On the other end of the line, I heard a wet, gurgling thud. Then, the sound of a phone hitting the floor. I looked back at the screen. Marcus, Sarah, Chloe, they were all starting to type. "I see it too," Sarah wrote. "It sounds so clear now," Marcus added. My vision began to blur, the edges of the room fraying into that same gray static I'd seen in the photo. I could feel my own skin starting to itch, a deep, internal crawling sensation as if my muscles were trying to detach themselves from my bones. The smell of the slaughterhouse filled my room, so thick I could almost taste the rot on the back of my tongue. I realized then that the ghost wasn't a person at all. It was a contagion, a viral piece of information that had finally finished incubating in our collective subconscious. We hadn't lost a friend, we had been hosting a parasite. I reached for the power button on my PC, but my fingers wouldn't move. They felt stiff, the joints locking into place. I looked down and saw the skin around my fingernails beginning to crack, tiny beads of dark fluid welling up in the fissures. The word was in my head now. It was the only thing I could think about. It was a beautiful, terrible sound that explained why we exist and how easily we can be unmade. I placed my hands on the keyboard. My vision was almost gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of gray noise, but I didn't need to see. I knew exactly which keys to hit. I began to type. I had to share it. I had to make sure everyone heard the word. Because once you hear it, you don't have to worry about being alone anymore. You just become part of the static. I hit enter. The last thing I felt was the sensation of my jaw unhinging, stretching wider than it was ever meant to go, as the word finally forced its way out of my throat. It felt like a cold, wet hand reaching up from my stomach and pulling my soul out through my mouth. And then there were 5.
Next story.
Growing up, I always assumed my parents were just eccentric or maybe a bit forgetful in a way that didn't have a medical name yet. Most families have their quirks, but ours was built around a very specific type of silence. We lived in a house that felt too large for 3 people, yet my parents insisted it was exactly the right size. There are 3 bedrooms upstairs. One is theirs, one is mine, and the third sits at the end of the hallway, its door painted a flat, clinical white that seems to absorb the light from the overhead fixture. That door has been locked since before I could walk. When I asked about it as a kid, my mom would just blink, her eyes going vacant for a split second, before asking if I wanted juice or if I'd finished my homework. It wasn't a no, it was a total system failure. Downstairs, the kitchen followed the same bizarre geometry. There were 3 chairs tucked under the heavy oak table. Every night, my mom would set the table for 2. My dad would sit on the left, I would sit on the right, and the middle chair would remain pushed in, an empty gap between us that felt like a missing tooth. They didn't just ignore the chair, they moved around it like it was a permanent fixture of the architecture, like a pillar or a wall. If I ever accidentally bumped it or tried to sit in it, the atmosphere in the room would curdle. My father's face would go slack, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth, staring at the space where a person should be with a look of profound, terrifying neutrality. The basement was the only place I felt like I could breathe, mostly because they never went down there. It was damp and smelled of wet earth and old insulation. Last week, while I was hunting for a spare light bulb, I noticed a corner of the floorboards in the crawl space looked loose. Underneath, tucked away in the dirt like a buried secret, was a small, leather-bound diary. The name embossed on the cover was Leo. I don't know any Leos. We don't have any relatives with that name. I took it to my room and read the whole thing in one sitting. The handwriting started out neat and rhythmic, the musings of a kid who liked drawing and wondered why his parents were acting so distant. But as the pages turned, the script became frantic, jagged, and smeared with something dark and crusty. Leo wrote about the middle child. He wrote about how he started to fade. He described the sensation of screaming at the dinner table while his mother wiped a smudge off his cheek as if she were cleaning a mirror, looking right through his eyes into the wall behind him. He wasn't being punished. He was being erased. The last entry was the one that broke me. He wrote about finding a word. He found it carved into the underside of the dining room table, right where the middle chair sits. He called it the slate cleaner. He wrote that the word wasn't a curse, but a release. If the world refuses to see you, eventually you start to agree with the world. He wrote that thinking the word didn't kill you, it just removed the anchor. It turned you into the static on the radio, the shadow that moves when you aren't looking, the cold draft in a room with all the windows shut. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the locked door at the end of the hall. I went to the kitchen at 3 a.m, crawling on my hands and knees with a flashlight clamped between my teeth. I slid under the oak table, my back pressing against the cold linoleum. I shined the light upward. The underside of the table was a graveyard of scratches, but right in the center, directly beneath where the middle chair stays tucked in, there was a word. It wasn't in any language I recognized. The letters were sharp, angular things that seemed to vibrate if I looked at them too long. Just seeing them made the back of my throat taste like rusted iron. It felt like my brain was trying to reject the shape of the letters. I heard footsteps above me. The floorboards groaned. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. My father walked into the kitchen. He didn't turn on the light. He just stood there, right next to the table. I could see his bare feet, the skin pale and translucent in the spill of my flashlight. He stood perfectly still for 10 minutes. He wasn't getting water. He wasn't raiding the fridge. He was just standing. Finally, he whispered something. It wasn't a name. It was just a soft, rhythmic clicking sound, like a moth hitting a light bulb over and over again. Then he turned and walked back to bed. The next morning, I decided to test it. I waited until breakfast. "Mom," I said, my voice cracking. "Who is Leo?" She was pouring coffee. The stream of liquid didn't stop. It hit the rim of the mug, splashed over the side, and began to scald her hand. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look down. The smell of burning skin and coffee filled the air. It was a sickening, sweet aroma mixed with the scent of raw, butchered meat. She just kept pouring, her eyes fixed on the window. "Mom, your hand." I lunged forward to grab the pot. She snapped her head toward me. Her pupils were so dilated that her eyes looked like twin pools of ink. "We have a lovely home, don't we?" she whispered. Her voice sounded like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. The skin on her hand was bubbling, turning a violent, angry red, the blisters weeping clear fluid onto the tablecloth. She didn't seem to feel a thing. I backed away, stumbling into the middle chair. As soon as my skin touched the wood, my father, who had been reading the paper, looked up. He didn't look at me. He looked through me. A profound sense of vertigo hit me, a massive weight pressing down on my chest that made it impossible to draw a full breath. I felt thin. I felt like I was made of smoke. I ran. I didn't go to school. I went back to the basement. I've been down here for hours now. I brought a kitchen knife with me, though I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could cut my way out of this feeling. I keep thinking about Leo. If he was my brother, why can't I remember his face? Why is there no space for him in my head? I went back to the diary. The very last page wasn't written in ink. It was scratched into the paper with something sharp. "It starts with the furniture," it read. "Then the photos. Then the blood. If they can't remember the person, the house has to eat the mess." I looked at my own hands. The tips of my fingers are starting to turn translucent. I can see the faint outline of the concrete floor through my nails. It doesn't hurt, but there's a dull, throbbing ache in my joints, like my bones are being replaced with cold air. I realized then that my parents aren't the ones doing this. They are just the symptoms. The house is the one with the neurological hardware issue. It can only support 2 souls. Anything more is a glitch that needs to be patched out. I heard the door at the top of the basement stairs creak open. "Honey," my mom called out. Her voice was perfectly normal now, sweet and motherly. "Are you down there? It's time for dinner. I've set the table for two. For two. I'm the only child left. If she's only set the table for two, and my dad is already sitting there, who am I?" I crawled back to the underside of the table just now. I'm sitting in the dark, the wood inches from my face. I can feel the word glowing. Not with light, but with a kind of psychic heat. It's pulsing. Every time it pulses, a little more of my memory slips away. I can't remember my favorite color. I can't remember the name of my first pet. I'm becoming the middle child. I can hear them upstairs. They are eating. The sound of silver clinking against porcelain is deafening in the silence. Clink, clink, clink. Then, the sound of a chair being pushed back. The middle chair. Someone is sitting in it. I can hear the wood groan under a weight that shouldn't be there. I can see the floorboards sagging directly above my head. A thick, dark liquid began to drip through the cracks in the ceiling, splashing onto my forehead. It wasn't water. It was thick and dark, smelling of a slaughterhouse in the height of summer, a wet, metallic, organic stench that made my stomach flip. I realized then that Leon never left. He's still in the chair. He's just the part of the house that the house forgot to clean up. He's the breeze that closes the door. He's the reason the walls bleed and the reason my mother can't feel her skin burning. I'm looking at the word now. The slate cleaner. If I say it, the ache in my bones will stop. I won't have to worry about the dripping ceiling or the locked door or the way my parents look right through me. I'll just be another draft in the hallway. I'll be the shadow that makes you turn your head in the dark, only to find nothing there. I can feel my tongue curling around the first syllable. It feels like swallowing a needle. My father is walking toward the basement door again. He's clicking his tongue. Click, click, click. He's coming to finish the patch. He's coming to make sure the room is empty. The word is so simple. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's the only thing that makes sense in a house built for two. I'm going to think it now. I'm going to let the air take me. If you ever feel a sudden chill in a warm room, or if you find a door locked that you swear you left open, don't look for a ghost. Just know that some families are only meant to be so big, and the house always knows how to do the math. I'm thinking it. The light is going gray. The smell of the earth is getting stronger. I'm almost gone.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.